In March of 1991, the world was introduced to a sequel by Capcom so massive at the time that it continues to this very day with the recent release of Street Fighter 6. Now, for those thinking only a few sequels have appeared since 1991, you would be very wrong. We have had Alphas, Supers, Zeros, Turbos versus Marvel versus Capcom. The list is truly endless. I won't even go into the Street Fighter movie. In my mind, you are either a Mortal Kombat or a Street Fighter player. I was strictly Street Fighter and first played Street Fighter 2 Turbo Edition, which was the packing game which I had with my Super Nintendo for Christmas in 1993. But today, prior to Turbo, we had the original Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, which is of course spawned many versions on many systems, which we are checking out today in this video. Be prepared to see Street Fighter 2 like you likely have never seen it before. I am not going to talk about each single version of the game in this video, as to be fair, around the PS2 generation these ports were literally arcade perfection, so really is no need of doing this. But anyways, let's get on with this video. We will begin by checking out this piece of work for the ZX Spectrum. As you can see, this truly is a pitiful attempt to cash in with the massive success and hype of the original arcade game. It's very clear to most people that the ZX Spectrum simply could not pull off a fast-paced game of this magnitude. Now, this version is actually running on 128K Model 2, and even with that Spectrum upgrade, the game looks terrible, plays terrible, to the point where I just stopped playing it altogether. Many Spectrum games have around 2 to 4 colours max at the same time as some colour clash, which hardened 8-bit microcomputer fans are used to, just like myself. But this just doesn't work on so many levels in this case. I just don't need to say much more. The gameplay says it all. I mean, the brains behind this port, which is of course the one and only US Gold, released this in '93. Let's be honest, most have moved on to at least 8-bit console at this point, whilst US Gold were still knocking around with quick cash grabs like this version. In this fight, I was up against E-Honda, which wasn't surprising. In this case, the computer had more of an idea what was going on than I actually did. I will add though that this version did include all 8 characters to play. Prior to the Atari ST version launching into my first fight, in this case, I was up against Ken in the USA. I thought this would be an okay port, and then the characters started moving around and all hope was totally gone. Firstly, although sound effects and music are incorporated, it sounds a little like the ST beginning to die a very slow death. Music was choppy and seemed like a combination of Street Fighter 2 intro music with some random music chucked in with it. Collision detection is okay if you happens to be the computer who was fighting against a human player. Every now and again I would get lucky and punch or kick Ken. Street Fighter 2 isn't good with slow speed, and this is proof. Its potential of pulling off special moves admittedly work better when you have several buttons and triggers to play with. The ST just doesn't cut this at all. I think the icing on the cake with this is that US Gold published this nonsense back in '93. It is not fun to play at all. Although all 8 characters from Capcom's original game are here, it really is pointless. Controls are so bad with this game, it might as well be broken. I once had this on the Amiga back in the day. It had around 4 discs, but one of those discs was broken, so never did get around to playing it. This monstrosity was released by, wait for it, yes, US Gold back in 1992. This was for ECS as well as older OCS model Amigas. Neither was particularly wonderful. Firstly, my character of choice has and always been Ryu, and has remained since. Ryu is extremely awkward to control in this, whilst I was put up against Chun-Li. I was attempting to pull off special moves, but simply did not happen. The colours looked like they had been faded away from age, or did this port always look this dull? One redeeming feature is voice, and that sounds fairly similar to the arcade original. Collision detection was just a mess. I found sometimes I hit Chun-Li to find that the health bar didn't even decrease. It's tragic to see such a capable machine that was once so far ahead of anything else was reduced to this trash. It's not particularly an enjoyable version to play either, but I suppose for those who didn't have a Super Nintendo or a Super Famicom back in '92, you would have possibly loved this just to say you had a copy of it. Who knows, I checked through Amiga Power magazine issue 22 from 1993, and they actually said, and I will quote, "I reckon you're going to be impressed with this." And then they had the cheek to score this 74% too. Although the Commodore 64's version of Street Fighter 2 is by no means any good at all, at least it is actually playable to an extent on this platform. Likely the easiest game of all time with no skill involved at all, an annoying loop of the character selection screen which plays throughout the entirety of this version. Ugly and over-pixelated backgrounds and sprites, controls are responsive enough, and hit detection is a little sporadic. I put very little effort into defeating E. Honda and Blanca during my fights. You could literally finish this game with your eyes closed. Your opponents deal you very little damage. This pitiable conversion released in 1992, and yet again, the famous or infamous US Gold were responsible for this version. Bit of a theme going on here, isn't there? Many people likely wouldn't be aware, but there was actually a Brazilian release of Street Fighter 2 back in 1997 by Tectoy. Brazil had a huge following for the Sega Master System, well into the times of where most of us around the world was playing the first PlayStation, Sega Saturn or Nintendo 64. Is this good port though? Well, it's certainly playable and to an extent a challenge to play too. As you can see in the background's imagery is missing. For example, when I was fighting Ken in the USA, the boat and people are all missing. This was likely to allow for a faster game itself by saving as much memory as possible on the cartridge. Obviously, the Master System only had 2 action buttons, and this wasn't as good as the next version on this list to pull off combos. It is a fairly fast game though, which surprised me. Musically, sounds much like the original, only in the 8-bit form. Surprisingly, the IBM DOS conversion was actually fairly playable. Normally in these arcade ports videos that I upload, DOS versions are often worse than the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga ports. Not the case for Street Fighter 2 though. Now, not exactly perfect. The noticeable thing is, like some other versions, we have a constant loop of different music playing throughout. Sadly, these aren't exclusive for each fighter's location like the original arcade version had. It does get a little annoying after a couple of minutes. Gameplay wise, although a little slow, it is playable and does present a fair good challenge. This is the US Gold version of this game for DOS, which is often praised. It was released back in 1992, and there was me thinking US Gold was terrible and notorious for publishing bad Street Fighter 2 conversions. This is testament that US Gold wasn't all that bad at all. Finally, we have arrived to the point where a port of Street Fighter 2 was half decent to play, an actual challenge in fact. The OG Game Boy version was like music to my ears. This 8-bit portable port firstly featured music which matches the source arcade game, a different track for each fight that is. This version actually meant I had to put some effort into winning a fight against Ryu in Blanca when I was put up against them. But is this actually a good version? Yes. It isn't bad at all. I would have been fairly impressed as a kid with this version if I didn't already have it on the Super Nintendo. I will mention here that US Gold wasn't responsible for this port. hence why we got a better version for the Game Boy. One thing to note here is that Street Fighter requires several different button combinations, and with only an A and B button with a D-pad, the OG Game Boy managed to pull this off really well. Graphically, for a Game Boy game, it looks good, and collision detection actually feels good in this version too. This was also a fairly late release for the OG Game Boy, being released back in 1995.
Round one, fight! Go to flame!
Now, it's not surprising that the 1992 release of Street Fighter 2 on the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom was a cut above the other ports in this list so far. Firstly, this one was actually brought to us by Capcom. Firstly, the game pretty much plays the same as the arcade original, sounds much like it too, controls just like it. This is a seriously impressive 16-bit console port. The colours and collision detection are spot on, the music and sound effects are also extremely good for this. I would imagine that, being Capcom's baby, they needed to ensure that its own console version matched the greatness of its arcade game. It also meant that new users of the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom would have a near perfect version of the arcade game too around a year after when the console itself was released. Many were impressed with this version back in the day, as well as myself when I eventually played it after owning the Street Fighter 2 Turbo Edition. I fought against Dhalsim and Chun-Li, and it truly felt like I had a challenge on my hands with this version. Awesome stuff. You might wonder why Sega Mega Drive or the Genesis never had this version. It had the Champion Edition, but never featured World Warrior, which is what we're looking at in this video.
Round one, fight!
Street Fighter 2 World Warrior is actually included on the Capcom Generation 5 disc. Surprisingly, the Saturn version is pretty much 100% spot on. It plays well, very responsive to controls, and collision detection is also very much spot on. Great music and sound effects with this version too. Colours used with this Saturn version do appear to be slightly darker than the next version of this.
You win! Fight!
Street Fighter Collection 2 contains the original Street Fighter 2 World Warrior, whereas the Sega Saturn didn't have this edition. Only one collection that didn't contain World Warrior. This port of the game is pretty much identical to the Sega Saturn's version, apart from what appears to look brighter in the PlayStation version. Again, good control response, great music and sound effects, very close if not 100% perfect to the original arcade game. I chose this one in a higher place, and like I say, between the Sega Saturn and the OG PlayStation version, there wasn't much difference, so I chose PlayStation 1 because this system means a little bit more to me. And my favourite port of Street Fighter 2 World Warrior is featured on the Capcom Classics Collections Reloaded pack for the PSP. This is a great version of the game. It's placed into a wider format, and so more of the game areas are visible compared to the typical 4:3 aspect ratio in the other versions in this video. This is by default, so I didn't mess around with video settings. The game itself is good as it looks. It's smooth, fast, and very responsive. Of course, the PSP had several buttons to complement each action that you try and pull off in the game. Music and sound effects are also included too, so a very good port of the game all in all, and it also features those bright and vibrant colours that the original arcade game had. And that's it for today's Street Fighter 2 arcade ports, worst to best. So let us know in the comments which your favourite version is, and do you actually agree with how I rank these? Just remember, be friendly, everyone's opinion is very different, and this is by far not an official ranking list. Until next video, thanks for watching.